All right, so we're going to start talking about the brain, which, as you know, has an amazing capacity to store information, but so often won't. It will, of course, just sometimes it feels like it doesn't. You gotta just work with it, and it'll work. So, starting in earliest embryonic development, the embryo has this nerve cord that goes down the dorsal side of the body, and that nerve cord then starts swelling at the anterior end. Those swellings develop into the structures of the brain that you can see here. The most anterior part, this blue part, becomes the cerebrum. And then the rest of the nerve cord continues all the way down through the vertebral column. So the brain, once it's finished developing after birth, it looks like this. The cerebrum is this top part, and that's where your conscious thought happens. The cerebellum is this wrinkly part down below, and that handles unconscious movement. Not involuntary, but like riding a bike if you don't think about it anymore. So I used to think that cerebrum and cerebellum were basically the same term. It turns out they're not. They're two different things. Cerebrum on top, cerebellum under it. And then the brainstem is this portion here. That's going to handle some of our most basic physiological needs, such as heart rate and breathing rate. And then the brainstem narrows and becomes the spinal cord. So this is looking at the brain, and you do need to be able to distinguish the anterior from the posterior side of the brain. And it's pretty easy if the cerebellum is attached. The cerebellum goes on the back, so that's the posterior side. But if you just see the cerebrum, it can be pretty easy to forget which side is the front. So if you look at the cerebrum, it kind of looks like a mitten. Like this is the thumb and this is where the fingers go. Yeah. Or it looks like a Muppet. Imagine, especially if you put the eyes right here, that's where the eyes would go. So this would be the mouth, yeah, of the puppet. And that part goes to the front. So it's either a mitten opening to the front, like a sock puppet, or it's a puppet. All right, this is what the bottom of the brain looks like. You can see they've put the eyes on here. And then we see all of these structures colored here in tan, which are cranial nerves. So these are part of the peripheral nervous system, nerves extending into and out of the brain. We'll talk about all of them, and yes, you do get to learn all of them. From the bottom, we can see the right and left frontal lobes, the temporal lobes, the cerebellum, and the brainstem here. And then we're also going to learn all of these structures seen from the sagittal section of the brain. And you can see that it looks like the cerebellum has been sectioned and the brainstem has been sectioned, but it looks like the cerebrum hasn't. Like it kind of looks like it does on the outside. And that's because the separation between the two hemispheres, the two hemispheres are separated all the way down to here. So this is the outside of the cerebrum. All right, so the cerebrum is divided into a right and left hemisphere. Both hemispheres, like I said, they're separated by this longitudinal fissure that goes down between them, and that goes pretty far down between them. A fissure is a long, narrow, and pretty wide division. We're going to have some fissures in the skull that are actual holes. Each hemisphere has 5 lobes. So you have a frontal lobe, so this is the right frontal lobe and the left frontal lobe. You have a right parietal lobe and a left parietal lobe, right occipital lobe, left occipital lobe. So all of the 5 lobes, you have right and left of each of them. The frontal lobe ends here at this indentation called the central gyrus. Now, a gyrus is an indentation, central sulcus. I can't talk today. Okay, I can do this. A gyrus is one of the bulges in the folds of the brain. A sulcus is an indentation or a groove. Okay, so when you see the word sulcus, think groove. When you see the word gyrus, think lump. Or you could think gyro or gyro, the sandwich, right? They're rolled up Yeah, kind of a round thing. Don't eat your brain, please. So anyway, the frontal lobe on either side ends at the central sulcus. I think I said central gyrus before. It's a sulcus. There it is there. And this controls your voluntary movement, and also your personality and decision making. We'll come back to that. Now the parietal lobe goes from the central sulcus to another sulcus back here called the parieto-occipital sulcus. Notice this is our, parieto-occipital, but it's hyphenated because we have these two O's next to each other. Okay. The temporal lobe is visible from the side. Let me go back up here. I should have fixed this. This is the temporal lobe here. Okay, and we have one of those on either side. And the temporal lobe has sections to process hearing and smell. And then we have in the back, behind the parieto-occipital lobe, we have the occipital lobe, parieto-occipital sulcus. Wow, I'm really doing bad today. The occipital lobe back here is going to process and store visual information. The fifth lobe is called the insula, and it sits deep to the temporal and frontal lobes. So this is a coronal section through the brain. Imagine we cut through here. And you can see that this outer layer of gray matter folds in like this. And this part here is the insula. Here they've used, in this diagram, probes to pull back the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe so you can see the insula back here. Okay, and this one is involved in emotional responses. It also has a center for taste. So from the side, this is the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, temporal lobe, and insula. These dotted lines are the sulci that you need to know. This is the central sulcus, parieto-occipital sulcus, and then this one here is called the lateral sulcus. Okay, and this is the front, this is the anterior side, the posterior side. Now, when we look at a cross-section through the brain, we can very clearly see the gray matter and the white matter. And we can see this on a dissection of the brain. So watch that video of me dissecting a sheep brain, and you'll really clearly see this. And the reason, you remember from last chapter, is that the white matter is myelinated. And so it looks white because it's full of fat, because the myelin is plasma membrane, which is phospholipids. The outer layer is gray matter, which means that it is primarily cell bodies and dendrites, which are not myelinated. Remember, it's just axons that are myelinated. So the gray matter in the brain is this outer layer that's called the cerebral cortex. The white matter makes up most of the inner layer, which is called the cerebral medulla. And then we also have white matter and gray matter interspersed. This connection here is called the corpus callosum, and that is at the bottom of the longitudinal fissure, and it's a connection between the right and left hemispheres. And then over here, we have these spots of gray matter, and those are called cerebral nuclei. A nucleus in the central nervous system is like a ganglion in the peripheral nervous system. You remember, a ganglion in the peripheral nervous system is a group of cell bodies. So that's the same thing we're going to have here. In these little sections, these are all groups of cell bodies, and of course they appear gray because cell bodies aren't myelinated. Ta-da! Okay, the outer layer is the cortex, the inner layer is the medulla. So this is cerebral cortex, cerebral medulla. Remember, gray matter makes up the cortex and the nuclei. It's cell bodies and dendrites. White matter makes up most of the medulla, and it's mostly myelinated axons. Now, if we take a section through here, lower down on the brain, we're looking through the cerebellum and the brainstem. Okay, and you can see again that we have a cortex on the outside in the cerebellum, a medulla on the inside, gray matter on the outside, white matter on the inside. The brainstem has a much different organization. And We'll talk about some of this organization, but a lot of it we're going to skip. It's complicated. Farther down still, down through this second bulge in the brainstem called the medulla oblongata, we see again interspersed gray matter and white matter. And then once we get to the spinal cord, the organization is really similar all the way down. And that's how we know when we've left the brainstem and entered the spinal cord. Now we have white matter on the outside and gray matter on the inside. Okay? So that's the organization of the brain and a little bit about the spinal cord. And when we get to the next section, we're going to start talking about the different areas within each lobe and what they're responsible for.